The last 24 hours, I am going to suggest, have been amongst the most momentous in the conflict up to now, though I would say that what has made them momentous is not anything specifically that's happened on the battlefronts, though there have been some things happening on the battlefronts, but dawning recognition in Ukraine and in the West that the Ukrainian counteroffensive, or offensive perhaps more properly speaking, the one that we've been hearing about ever since last autumn, the one that's been talked about ad infinitum and prepared for, and for which all those Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, that this offensive, at least in its original conception, has failed. Now, before I turn to that, I am going to say a few brief things about the situations on the battlefronts. The first thing to say is that the Ukraine has continued sporadically to launch attacks on various places on the southern fronts. Now, if you all take your mind back about 10 days ago, we were hearing about how Ukraine had paused its offensive. It's now fairly clear that the offensive remains paused. There was talk at the time when it was being paused that Ukraine would launch further big offensive strikes in the second half of June. We're now in July, and that hasn't really happened. As I've discussed in my most recent programs, there was an attempt by Ukraine to shift the weight of the advances towards Bakhmut, into the Bakhmut area. There's been heavy fighting there. Bakhmut, in some respects, was an easier target, but it's now become clear that despite the fact that the Russians have had less time to consolidate in the Bakhmut area, they haven't had the time to build the elaborate fortifications that they have done in other places. Notwithstanding all of that, Ukraine's attacks in the Bakhmut area up to now have continued to be unsuccessful. And in Orechov, on the Vremevka ledge, near Pyatikhatki, Ukraine has basically ground to a stop kilometers north of the major Russian fortified lines. And the other important attack that Ukraine tried to launch, or at least some kind of event that's not entirely easy to understand, but anyway, the landing that they tried to launch under the protection of the remaining parts of the Antonovsky Bridge near Kherson across the Dnieper River. Well, it's not entirely easy to disentangle all of the information about this, but it seems that that attack has now also failed. There was an Iskander missile strike on the Ukrainian positions. The Russian Ministry of Defense says another 30 Ukrainian soldiers were killed, and Sladko, the governor of Kherson region, says that mopping up operations are underway. But in effect, the Ukrainian attack, the Ukrainian strike there has collapsed. And in fact, early this morning, we got reports that Russian Marines coming up on speedboats took the remaining Ukrainian troops on the East Bank, if they really are on the East Bank, or on one of these islands. I'm not sure. Russian accounts about this incident have been extremely contradictory. But anyway, Russian Marines have apparently taken these troops in the rear. There's now, for the first time, by the way, confirmation that the Ukrainians managed to occupy some kind of hotel complex, presumably on the East Bank, but apparently that's now been stormed. And anyway, that operation also seems to have failed. And in the meantime, Russian missile and drone strikes continue on the same basis as always. And there's also been further reports that the Russian Navy has changed the camouflage scheme of its ships. This is presumably done to make them more difficult to detect by ATACMS missiles, if they ever arrive, Storm Shadow missiles, but I suspect principally these seaborne drones, long-range torpedoes in some ways, that Ukraine has been trying to launch to them. And there's pictures now of the Russian Navy. And it's important to stress that since the loss of the Moskva back in May of last year, Russia hasn't lost a single ship. And since the start of the offensive in June, at the start of June, Russia hasn't lost a single aircraft to Ukrainian action. Anyway, that's where we are, it seems to me, on the battlefronts. Always we get reports from the Russian Defense Ministry about Russia inflicting horrendous losses on Ukraine. And I discussed in my program yesterday how a Kiev institute appears to be bearing out those claims. A staggering 78% of respondents to this particular Ukrainian-conducted poll confirms that they know people who have either died or been wounded over the course of this conflict, with, I believe, the average being 6. The average number of the people they know being 6, and incidentally and in passing, I'm also seeing reports, not always easy to assess these reports, but anyway, I'm seeing reports that Ukraine is trying to extend even further the scope of its mobilization, which many perhaps rightly take to be further proof that Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses and that its reserves are now becoming depleted. Anyway, let's come back to the cascade of reports which we have got over the last 24 hours, that things are going very wrong. The first was a report by a Canadian journalist who said that the fundamental problem Ukraine is suffering from is that its troops on the front line have inadequate training. And he spoke about, again, the enormously heavy losses that Ukraine is suffering, the fact that the troops are not trained up to the level that they need to be in order to conduct offensive operations, or indeed any kind of military operations, without suffering exorbitant losses. And he spoke about Ukrainian soldiers being pressed into the fight after just 2 weeks training. And this, according to this particular Canadian journalist, is Ukraine's Achilles heel. The fact that they're basically run out of properly trained manpower. Well, that was a Canadian journalist. Then we had a report in the Wall Street Journal. The report in the Wall Street Journal spoke about the Ukrainians being shocked by the elaborate and incredibly strong fortifications that the Russians have created. And it spoke about these fortifications having somehow come as some kind of a surprise, which I don't understand. People have been talking about these fortifications since autumn. And it appeared to attribute the fact that the offensive is not advancing as quickly as some expected to the fact of the existence of these fortifications. What this article did not make clear is that Ukraine has not actually reached the fortifications, these heavy fortified lines, in any place on the battlefronts. In Zaporozhye region and in Kherson region, where Ukraine has been conducting perhaps the most powerful attacks, at least up to the ones where it started launching its other attacks in the Bakhmut area about a week ago. Well, the fighting has got bogged down in places like the Vremevka Ledge, close to the town of Orechov, still around the village of Pyatikhatki, which Ukraine has failed to capture. The Ukrainians have been able to capture the odd hamlet here and there. By some assessments, they've been able to take something like 50 square kilometers of territory. But none of this is anywhere close to the big Russian fortified lines. And when I say that they've captured around 50 square kilometers of territory, at least that is the assessment that apparently Western intelligence officers are making. Seymour Hersh spoke about around 40 square miles, to which Ukraine might have added, 40 square miles that Ukraine might have captured in the first days of the offensive, another 4 square miles that it may have captured since then. What none of this acknowledges is that this was all territory. This is all territory which until January was in the grey zone. In other words, it was contested territory. It was territory that the Russians, in that advance which they conducted in January, occupied, not as many thought as part of a springboard for an offensive towards Zaporozhye city or to capture Orekhov or for any of those purposes, but in order to lay vast minefields, to create a sort of zone of control north of the fortifications. This is not, in other words, territory that is important to the Russians, or which is in fact a part of the area, the core area that they need to control. So this report by the Wall Street Journal is both accurate about the extent of the fortifications. It is misleading about the fact that this has come as a shock to the Ukrainians. If it has come as a shock to the Ukrainians, then I cannot understand why, given, as I said, that we've always known that these fortifications were there. And to be frank, it's also something of a shock to me that the Wall Street Journal and others seem to attribute the failure of Ukraine's advances to the existence of these fortifications, given that Ukraine hasn't properly reached them. I will qualify the last point by saying that perhaps one thing that Ukraine and its Western sponsors might have underestimated and not fully appreciated was the extent and complexity of the very elaborate minefields that the Russians have created in this zone of control. It seems clear, for example, that the attack that was launched on the 8th of June south of Orekhov, the one which ended in complete disaster, as even the Western media, the US media, is now acknowledging. It ran into minefields, and it seems that both Ukraine and its Western backers had not appreciated either the scale or complexity of these minefields and their sophistication and the way in which the Russians were able to exploit these minefields in order to destroy the armoured units that Ukraine was launching in this desperate attempt to reach Russia's fortified lines. So in that one respect, maybe the article, the Wall Street Journal article, is correct. Anyway, all of this is to some extent overshadowed by the reappearance of General Zaluzhny. Now, General Zaluzhny has been out of view for weeks. There's a massive amount of speculation as to his exact whereabouts and what he was doing. My initial view was that he just didn't believe in this offensive. But of course, there were other reports that he'd gone to the west, that he'd been severely wounded, that he was in some sort of a coma, that he was receiving treatment after shock from a shell attack, that he might be suffering from depression, and the last was a possibility that I myself floated. Well, I have now reverted essentially to my original view, which is that the reason that General Zaluzhny dropped out of sight is because he was always consistently opposed to the launch of this offensive in the way in which it has been launched. And he is now given an article, an interview to the Washington Post, this immediately after a telephone conversation that he has had with General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, which, to be very clear, is full of recriminations. Now, I want to say the latter because, of course, the Washington Post is anxious to give a positive spin to this particular interview. And in some ways, Zaluzhny himself, who is after all a military officer bound under the chain of command, he isn't going to say that the offensive is failing, that Ukraine is losing. But nonetheless, if you actually parse carefully what he says in this interview, it's absolutely clear that he is furious, that he's very, very unhappy about this offensive, and that he's now being wheeled out both to try to repair the damage and, in effect, to call the whole thing off, or at least put it on some kind of a pause until the situation, the problems which, in his opinion, argued against this offensive have been remedied. And by that I mean that he is now complaining angrily about the fact that an offensive was launched against heavily fortified Russian positions, against heavily equipped, trained and fully effective Russian troops. He's insisted upon the latter point. He's poured cold water on the suggestion that the Wagner forces, which have been pulled out of the front lines and were pulled out of the front lines back in May, that their withdrawal has in any way weakened the Russian military positions. Anyway, he has criticized the whole original conception of the offensive. He says that the Ukraine was asked to conduct an offensive against these heavily fortified Russian lines, against these trained Russian troops without air cover. He asks rhetorically, which military would do such a thing? Not the NATO military, not the Russian military. In any case of this nature, when a military like that was planning some kind of offensive, they would be seeking air cover for their troops. And I get to turn to that in a moment. But anyway, he says that he doesn't understand how an offensive, in effect, could have been launched, how the West could be insisting on rapid results from an offensive without Ukraine being provided with air cover. He says that he doesn't understand why, with 3 times, or is it twice as many Western aircraft operating on Ukraine's western borders as the Russian Air Force is deploying in Ukraine itself, he doesn't understand why the West can't just simply give Ukraine enough fighter jets in order to redress the balance and provide it with air power. And he also complains bitterly about ammunition shortages. He says again, how can he conduct a successful offensive when he is completely outgunned? And he says that the Russians outgun Ukraine 10-1. Now that might be an exaggeration, an overestimate. It's a figure, though, that the Ukrainians have given in the past. But anyway, he is basically saying that he's not going to achieve a breakthrough unless he gets far more ammunition, far more artillery, and he gets aircraft, he gets fighter jets. And he even gives a figure. He says that he doesn't need 120 fighter jets. Now, one wonders where he got that number from. I suspect that in private discussions, the Ukrainians have in fact asked for exactly that number of fighter jets. I remember that there was a public report when they were reported to have done exactly that. He's now saying that he needs far fewer than that. He doesn't say how many he needs. But anyway, he is basically saying that he needs air cover. Now, I get to say something here, which is that air cover is not the same as air superiority. And I think this is a crucial difference. I speak, again, as someone who is not a military expert. But it's one thing to be able to provide some kind of air protection for your forces as you advance, so that the enemy air force doesn't bomb them, and air cover would do that. But I would have thought that in order to break through fortified lines as complex and as strong as the ones that the Russians have created, you would need much more than that. You would need hundreds of aircraft with heavy bombs to be able to break these fortifications. And Zaluzhny himself appears to be conceding that that isn't going to happen. Now, I say that because that is exactly what the NATO did over the course of the war with Iraq in 1991 to liberate Kuwait. The US and its allies conducted I seem to remember from memory, it was a 2-month air campaign, maybe it was even longer than that, basically to break Iraqi defenses, to break through Iraqi defense lines. That was extremely difficult to do. And perhaps it was never fully completed, because reports I've seen about this war, about which I am not an expert, suggest that in fact what actually happened was that the Iraqi defense lines were not broken by this air campaign, or had not been broken yet by this air campaign, but that Saddam Hussein, for reasons best known to himself, decided to withdraw his troops from Kuwait without coming to some kind of an agreement to do that first with the United States, and that this is what caused the entire Iraqi position in Kuwait to collapse. I'm not an expert on this war, but all I will say is the United States was not prepared to launch, as far as I can see, an advance into Kuwait to liberate Kuwait until those heavy fortified lines were broken, and the mighty US Air Force, backed by the air forces of France and Britain and the Arab states, spent weeks upon weeks bombing these fortifications, bombing facilities right across Iraq in order to break those fortifications before an offensive was even considered. And the key thing to understand is that the fortifications that Saddam Hussein's engineers built in Kuwait were in no conceivable way comparable in sophistication to those that the Russians have created in this conflict zone, and nor, of course, were the Iraqi troops comparable in training or equipment to the Russian forces that we see in Ukraine. So, Zaluzhny might want fighter jets, but he would actually probably need far more than he says now in order to make a difference. He would need not just to give himself air cover for his forces, he would probably need air superiority. And I have to say, I think this is beyond his reach, even if the West supplies him F-16s, and as many people, Scott Ritter, for example, in a program he did with us, a live stream he did with us on the DURAN, he actually said that the F-16 is a less effective fighter jet than the Sukhoi 35s, and certainly the Sukhoi 57s, and MiG-31s, and Sukhoi 30s, and other fighter jets that the Russians already employ in the conflict zone. So what Zaluzhny is demanding, he will get F-16s, but they might not change things as decisively as he expects. Anyway, that was Zaluzhny. And of course, with fighters, with aircraft, well, something can be done. Something might also be done in terms of long-range missiles Storm Shadows have already been supplied with only very partial results up to this point. But ATACMS missiles might be on the way, but apparently not in huge numbers, because the United States doesn't have huge numbers of these things. But on the ammunition question, here the problems are insuperable, something which Zaluzhny himself simply doesn't acknowledge. He complains about the 10-to-1 advantage that the Russians have. He says that he needs to have at least as many shells as the Russians in order to succeed in this offensive. He complains that he's not getting anything like that many. He demands more, but he doesn't seem to acknowledge that more cannot come for the simple reason that more cannot exist. I'm not going to go over this whole topic of ammunition and ammunition shortages, save to say that already, even as Ukraine fires only a fraction of the number of shells that the Russians do over the course of this conflict, Ukraine is actually expending many more shells than the West, than the entire collective West is capable of producing. And this problem isn't going to be resolved in any foreseeable time scale that could help Ukraine. A resolution, if the West mobilized its industrial economy in order to solve this problem, would be years away. And Ukraine doesn't have those years. And in the meantime, Russia continues to crank out shells and guns. Shells probably in terms of millions of rounds now a year. Scale far beyond what the West can achieve. So that's Zaluzhny. Now, Zaluzhny didn't just give this interview to the Washington Post, and you can see that he's basically saying the entire offensive, as originally planned, was misconceived. We've also now had comments from General Milley. Now, General Milley had this, I suspect, scorching conversation with Zaluzhny, and Milley has come out and he said, well, this is going to be a very slow burn offensive. It's going to only advance weeks, getting weeks and perhaps months before anything significant is achieved. He doesn't acknowledge, General Milley does not acknowledge at any point the enormous losses Ukraine is absorbing and the struggles it is having to absorb human losses. But anyway, already you can see, or at least the way I read it, is that Milley also has now written off the possibility of any quick breakthroughs, and he accepts that this simply isn't going to happen. And basically, he is postponing the final recognition of the failure of the offensive to a date after he himself ceases to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then we've had Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister. Now, he's been a little bit more reticent. He's not quite spoken out in quite the same way. But he too has now downplayed the prospects of this offensive. He says that the offensive, obviously it's slow. It's obviously not happening as dramatically and as quickly as people thought it would. But the fact is, some very slow incremental progress is being made, and people should not expect more. And by the way, coming back to Zaluzhny, he made comments about the Leopard 2 tanks, which, in my opinion, came very close to being contemptuous. He was apparently asked about the fact that Leopard 2s and Bradleys have been burning on the battlefronts. And he said, well, these are not parade vehicles. They were intended for war. What do you expect? If you actually use them in a battle, some of them will get destroyed. But he spoke about them. The way he spoke about them, the sort of words he used, I'm not going to read the exact words because this is all behind a paywall in the Washington Post. But the way he spoke about them, to my mind, suggested that he was not quite as impressed by these vehicles as some people in the West had thought. And of course, his point is that on the battlefields they are a target and that they burn as quickly and as comprehensively as any other tank or infantry fighting vehicle that is supplied. And then lastly, we have Zelensky himself. And Zelensky has been making all kinds of comments. He still says that he's going to press on with this offensive because he wants to achieve some result before the NATO summit meeting. But he also says that his forces are advancing much more slowly than he'd hoped because of ammunition shortages. And I've said that there is no simple answer to this problem. In fact, there is no answer to this problem. And he also, of course, again, brought up the topic of torrential rain, that the offensive has been slowed down, delayed by torrential rain. And he also complains angrily that not all of the weapons that the West said that they would supply have in fact reached Ukraine. But again, the timeline of all of this has been very well known. The Pentagon leaks of a few months ago basically told us how brigades were being trained and what their equipment would be in preparation for this offensive, the 12 brigades that would be readied for this offensive. There's no evidence that these brigades have failed to receive the equipment that was originally assigned to them. The West has indeed agreed to provide other equipment, but it was not the equipment that was supposed to be used for this specific offensive. And if we're talking about the Leopard 1 tanks and the other machines, well, they will no doubt come later, the Abrams tanks, but they'd never been earmarked for this offensive in the first place. So, in summary, it seems to me that this is not quite yet an admission that the offensive itself has failed. I don't think we will ever get that, actually. But it's as close to that admission as we're going to see, at least prior to the July Vilnius NATO summit meeting. And on Zaluzhny's part, at least, it comes with bitter recriminations. I suspect, as I said, that his telephone conversation with Milley was a scorcher. He's very careful to say in the article, in the interview he gave to the Washington Post, that Milley himself agrees with him, which, again, if true, and I, by the way, suspect it is, that, again, casts Milley's own actions, in my opinion, in a most unfavourable light. But we're going to not go there now. But anyway, we are, as I said, on the brink of at least a private acceptance in Ukraine and in the West that the offensive, the great spring-summer offensive, as originally conceived by Ukraine, that it's not going to work, that at the very least there has to be a stop and a rethink before the offensive itself is renewed, and that may not happen now before the F-16s arrive with the ATACMS missiles, and even that might not make the great difference that people imagine. And of course, in the meantime, Russia continues to crank out more ammunition, more tanks, more infantry fighting vehicles, more guns. Every day you hear of more batches of these things being delivered by Russian military. And of course, the Russians also continue to train up and deploy more troops. Their forces in the conflict zone are becoming stronger. Now, that's where we are. What the West decides to do about all of this is another matter. But there might be some indications that some kind of discussions will shortly be underway. Lavrov has already now said that the West is trying to freeze the conflict in Ukraine. He's just made another statement to that effect. He is essentially ruling that out And there have in fact been diplomatic contacts of a certain nature between the United States and Russia. So we learned that CIA Director Burns, who it turns out visited Kiev in secret at the beginning of June, in what it looks like to have been another attempt to find out what would happen when the offensive was launched. This is before the offensive began to go catastrophically wrong. But anyway, it does look as if he went there with some kind of mandate to explore with the Ukrainians some possibility of negotiations. But anyway, he has now telephoned his opposite number in Russia, Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of the SVR, Russia's intelligence agency, and it seems that Burns's overt purpose was to assure Narishkin that the United States had no role at all in the Prigozhin affair. We don't know whether Narishkin and the Russians accepted that, but one way or the other, I also suspect that it was intended again to establish some kind of contact with Narishkin, perhaps exploring the way for talks sometime soon. Now, I think, as I said, that we will start to see some move towards negotiations crystallize in the autumn. But can I say that before that happens, I do expect one last attempt to achieve some kind of breakthrough on the battlefronts. And that will be when the F-16s and the ATACMS missiles arrive. If the F-16s and the ATACMS missiles fail, then all that will be left will be the supplies of the Leopard 1 tanks and the lighter guns, the 105mm guns, and all of those sort of things, which virtually everybody agrees are insufficient to deter the Russians, to defeat the Russians. And given that the Russian military in Ukraine is becoming bigger and stronger, and that the Ukrainian military is becoming weaker and smaller, I think that once we're past that point, the West will certainly be looking to find some kind of a way out. And the priority then, I suspect, will be to avoid any thought of Chinese mediation. Now, I'm going to just now finish this program by just mentioning just a few quick things. Firstly, there was supposed to be an EU Latin America summit. Zelensky tried to insert himself into it. The Latin American states vetoed that, so Zelensky wasn't able to get an invitation. And it looks like the EU wanted him there, but they have now again been confronted by the fact that the Latin American states didn't want that to happen. And following up on the mess left over from the Prigozhin affair, I said that President Putin would now have his work cut out, calling various leaders around the world to try to reassure them that the situation in Russia is stable. Well, he has now spoken to Prime Minister Modi of India, and it was in fact Modi who called him. But we read, this is the first paragraph of the Russian readout, in connections with the events of June 24th, that's the Prigozhin mutiny, Narendra Modi expressed understanding and support of the resolute actions by the Russian leadership to protect law and order and ensure stability in the country and security of its people. So we can see that Modi accepted Putin's assurances, and we learn there's a lot of discussions of various things in this readout. I'm not going to discuss this at this point, but we read at the end that the conversation was substantive and constructive. The leaders confirmed their mutual desire to strengthen the Russia-India specially privileged strategic partnership and planned future contacts. So Putin working hard to, as I said, reassure Russia's friends. And as I said, there's been this call for from Modi. This is obviously an arranged call, and as we see, that diplomatic initiative appears, at least for the moment, to be working. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me repeat again, you can find all of our programs on our various channels: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also find find all sorts of great things in our shop: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all our great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this program, to this channel. Thank you again for joining me. More from me soon, and have a very good day.